Beyond Resilience is a series of curated conversations created by Firelight.
Beyond Resilience does a lot to keep people connected and keep people talking about films or talking about issues, connecting our filmmakers and other filmmakers together.
We wanted to create a space where our community, that is BIPOC documentary filmmakers, could lead a conversation.
We have to do a better job of knowing that films aren't just what we can physically see on the screen. It's about the people that put in the blood, sweat, and tears behind the scenes.
Knowing that what you're so passionate about, someone looks at as unmarketable or niche. Who's the audience for this? Who's going to care about this, right? And those simple things that people say are like daggers to you.
I think that is the part of the violence of the model minority shit, that it like shaves away our history of resistance, of rebellion, of ferocity.
We have always resisted. We have always fought back in many different forms.
It's an evolving form. You have to evolve or not you will stagnate.
You have to have intention to change, and you have to understand that you're not changing to try to give anybody a gift, but you're changing so that you can do your job better.
What we're asking for is just proportional access, proportional resources, proportional marketing money, so that it does actually meet its mission, so that it does actually lean into the diversity of perspectives.
I hope that Beyond Resilience will keep its edge, will keep pushing the boundaries of the conversations that we need to have, and will keep growing its audiences, pulling in new people from the industry, outside the industry. It continues to be a space where people can have a BIPOC creator-led conversation. That is what it's about.
Marsha, we're coming to you here in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Marsha Smith. I'm president of Firelight Media. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. Thank you for joining us for this Beyond Resilience Masterclass on the historical importance of personal archives for filmmakers, artists, and historians. I am a Black woman with clear glasses on, a kind of medium-sized afro, and a gray t-shirt. I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement to raise awareness of Indigenous history and land rights, and to express our intention to stand in solidarity with Indigenous people. I am on Martha's Vineyard, the land of the Wampanoag people. We all have a responsibility to consider what it means to acknowledge the history and the legacy of colonialism and genocide. I encourage all of you to make land acknowledgements in the chat. Our chat moderator will drop a link. If you need one, you can click to learn about the people whose ancestral lands you are on or live on. This masterclass is a substrand of our Beyond Resilience series, and it's made possible by the National Endowment for the Humanities. The series of 4 masterclasses aims to highlight how films and filmmakers, in partnership with humanities scholars, have the power, and in fact, I'd say the responsibility, to educate the public about our shared history. Beyond Resilience is also supported in part by Open Society Foundations, the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, and the New York City Council, the National Endowment for the Arts, and Field of Vision. And we're grateful to all of our partners for making this possible. We'd also like to thank the generous community of individuals and organizations whose support directly benefits our growing family of filmmakers. If you'd like to make a donation in support of Firelight's work, please use the link in the chat or use our text to give option. You can text the word LIGHT, that is LIGHT, to 801-801 right now to make a tax-deductible contribution. That number again is 801-801, and the word is LIGHT. We appreciate your support. Thank you to Deb Goodfriend for your live captioning services. Thank you to Felicia Chanko and her colleagues for your technical assistance. Today's panel centers around the importance of personal archives. What constitutes an archive? How might storytellers use them to question long-held narratives about a historical figure or any given culture? And with the more recent ability of smartphones to record and share videos in real time, creating a seemingly infinite archive, what might the future of archival storytelling look like? To explore these conversations with today's esteemed panelists, we've invited Beyond Resilience series producer Jean-Pierre Regis to moderate this afternoon's discussion. Jean-Pierre is the director of the acclaimed documentary Duty Free, a personal film that examines ageism, the care crisis, and economic insecurity in America. He's also an alum of Firelight Media's Documentary Lab and a recipient of our Impact Campaign Fund. He was also a Film Independent Documentary Fellow. In Jean-Pierre's life, he's been a contributor for CNN, Headline News, MTV, CBS, covering stories of youth political activism and pop culture. We're thrilled to have Jean-Pierre guide us through. For those of you who were able to attend our party at Sundance, our first pandemic party, you know Jean-Pierre is an excellent guide and host to many things. But to have him here today to guide us through what I know will be an informative and provocative discussion. I also want to thank our audience. Many of you sent in great questions in advance of this event. Those questions have helped inform today's program. We'll also have a lot of time for live questions at the end of the program, and we appreciate all of your presence, all of your interest, and your enthusiasm. And I'll now turn it over to Jean-Pierre to introduce our panelists.
Thank you so much, Marcia. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. I know it will be a very exciting discussion. I'm Jean-Pierre Regis. My pronouns are he, him, his. I'm a tan Black man with currently dyed orange hair, a blue button-down shirt. My background is a wall with photos and painting that I own. As I introduce today's panel participants and read their brief bios, I welcome attendees to share questions for the participants in the Q&A panel at any time, and there will be time set aside for audience questions. I know that we received a lot of them early, but if you have any new ones, please do put them in the chat and we'll address them at the end of the event. Now, to introduce the panelists, most of you probably know Stanley Nelson. Stanley Nelson's films combine compelling narratives with rich historical detail to shine new light on the underexplored American past. Awards received over the course of his career include a MacArthur Genius Fellowship, 5 Primetime Emmy Awards, and Lifetime Achievement Awards from the Emmys and International Documentary Association. He recently earned his first Oscar nomination for his highly acclaimed documentary Attica, and his film A Place of Our Own, arguably his most personal film and one created in part from personal archives, debuted on Independent Lens in 2004, and it is a beautiful, beautiful film, which also showcases Marcia Smith. Bing Liu is a China-born, Midwest-raised filmmaker, best known for directing Minding the Gap, which was nominated for Best Feature Documentary at the 91st Academy Awards and won a Peabody Award. He was also a segment director on America to Me and co-directed All These Sons with Josh Altman, cinematography at the 2021 Tribeca Film Festival and the Maisels Award at the Denver International Film Festival. He is currently developing several scripted and nonfiction projects. Go off, Bing. Laurie Poirier, Oglala Lakota, is an enrolled member of the Oglala Sioux tribe and has served as the president of the First Peoples Fund since 1999. The First Peoples Fund honors and supports the collective spirit of Native artists and culture bearers through fellowships, grants, and community-based partnerships. She is a 2017 Ford Foundation Art of Change Fellow, a recipient of the 2013 Women's World Summit Foundation Prize for Creativity in Rural Life, and a 2013 Louis T. Delgado Distinguished Grantmaker Awardee. And finally, we have Eliza Kelly, who is an assistant professor of English and African American Studies at Yale. Kelly writes and teaches on a range of subjects from African American literature, visual art, and Black geographies to archives and historical fiction. Her writing can be found in Antipodes, a radical journal of geography, The New Inquiry, and Cabinet Magazine, Dean Journal, and elsewhere. So thank you all for joining us. We're really excited. I know I've chatted with each of you individually, and I know together we will have a really, really wonderful panel around archives. Just so everybody knows exactly how this will run, it will be in 3 acts. At the first act, we'd have all panelists sort of set a baseline or try on what archives are and how to create one. That'll be defining the archive. Then we'll move on to Act 2, discussing our approaches to personal archives. And then in Act 3, we'll spend just a little time thinking about archival futures, particularly with the rise of tech and smartphones, as Marcia mentioned. And then we'll move on to questions. Again, thank you all for joining us, and I hope you enjoy the masterclass. Please do put questions in the chat if you have any. So everyone, thanks again for coming. Let's start right off with a lob-up question, which is, how do you define an archive yourself? And with that, what makes an archive different than maybe just a photo, images, or audio? What gives the archive name its name? What makes it special? And I'd love to start with you, Stanley, because I know that you have dealt with many an archive.
Yeah, I try to think about archive as being, anything from, national endowment to, Library of Congress to something that people have, personal archive. I just try to think of it all in kind of the same way, if you have one picture, then it's archive. I try not to distinguish kind of the set archive from the the things that people have personally.
We were talking earlier, and First Peoples, Indigenous folks, there is sort of a tension in some ways around archives, particularly around sort of treaties. So much of Indigenous folks' history is oral, and so how do you think about archives among your community?
Peti Washte Mitakiapi Makasi Tomniomani Lee. I'm Lori Oglala Lakota. I'm honored to be here. And I think about archives in terms of where I was raised on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, and in relationship to our 1851 treaty and our 1868 treaty. So much was extracted and taken from our tribal communities. Everything from grave sites, stolen grave sites, and so much stolen, I guess, for me is when I think about archives, I just think more about our histories, our knowledge, our identity, and the ways we attempt to hold on to that today in contemporary times and restore and rebuild and reclaim those histories, and how to tell our stories in new ways, and then how to be able to tell those stories in truth telling, in terms of what happened in our communities. And then also recognizing that tribal citizens and tribal peoples have such a history with this United States government, in the federal system. So much of our archives is stored in places across the country. And I can talk more about that and the movement, that happened from the 70s on up around reclaiming and repatriating, and some of the laws that were passed to help us do that. So, Amaya. Thank you.
Yes, I'm really, really excited to dive into that, and the reclaiming of archives, I think, is a really, really powerful movement and a necessary one. Bing, how do you think about archives?
Yeah, I think there's 2 things that I think about it. One is, like who gets to have an archive. I think there's a certain amount of privilege that comes with being able to have something documented, whether it's about your personal life or whether it's about your community. And then the second thing I think about is, I think what moves something beyond photos, videos, memorabilia, is categorization. I think the categorization and the contextualization of these things, of these memorabilia, is a creative act. And it's especially so, as filmmakers, oftentimes we're dealing with archives that are not our own, but that are also have a creator that we no longer have access to. So then it just becomes a lot more important what context is around the archive that we're working with. So yeah, I think, like, to answer your question, I think it has to do with contextualization.
So you're saying in some ways there's an aspect of meaning. So archives maybe are photos, and tell me if I'm wrong, photos, images, video that on its own are just photos, images, and videos. But when we are in search for sort of a greater meaning or some sort of creativity that would maybe tie those pieces together, then that's where it becomes an archive of sorts.
Yeah, I think it's the delta, right? It's the journey in between, the original intent of creating whatever memorabilia that's created, and then it's about, like, what happens in that reinterpretation. I think that's where archive sort of takes on its definition.
Thank you. Eliza, curious, as a literary scholar, how do you think about archives generally? And do you have your own? Have you created your own personal archive yet?
Thank you for that question. Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting hearing everyone's responses because, in my line of work, this is like a site of really contentious debate, is sort of what is an archive? How can it be defined? What are the kind of limits and boundaries? Because on the one hand, you have lots of different sorts of applications and uses of the term archive, especially over the last 15, 20 years. And on the other hand, archive does have a very specific definition, right? So the sort of noun archive, which is the collection of historical records, right? Or the place where historical records are stored and collected. And then you have the verb archive, right, which is sort of the process of placing or storing something in an archive, so into that place or collection. But, I think in recent years, archive has been used by lots of sort of literary scholars and cultural studies scholars to sort of describe any practice of recording or preservation. It's also come to sort of symbolize history itself, in particular, at least for my discipline, white Western history, which is viewed as a project of sort of producing dominant historical narratives through exclusion and erasure. So that idea that, history is written by the victors or the colonists or the enslavers or the wealthy. So, I think archive has also taken on lots of symbolic meaning. Ultimately, I think that archive specifically is defined by the particular labor entailed in preserving materials in a systematic way. So I think sort of similarly, that idea of categorization. So I think we should actually, it's my belief that we should focus less on maybe claiming the term archive and more on actually restoring value to practices of collecting and preserving and safeguarding and transmitting stories and knowledge within our communities. And maybe even letting go of the need for those practices to have value in the eyes of the state or sort of according to the logics of white Western history, right? So I think that archives are distinct from collections, but I think that, we should be thinking about how we can consider collecting just as valuable as sort of state-sanctioned archives.
I love that. I love that response. And I think you and Lori will have a lot to talk about because I think there's a lot of overlap in maybe your perspective on that. Curious, I think archives have the ability to be to touch you, right? I mean, they in film, they can be used as a crutch, a way for you to see something when you're learning something, you know, to keep you interested. But they can also really be so impactful. They can really move you. And so I just wanted to really briefly, if we can go around, and if there was ever a moment that you came into contact with a photo from the past or some sort of archive that moved you deeply to your core, you can't forget about it. What was that item or moment, if you are okay talking about it? I just want to know kind of what it was and how it made you feel. We'll start with Bing.
Yeah, there's a photo of my grandfather as a young man, and it's the only photo I have of him that's not of him as this gray-haired, you know, person who was holding me as a baby. And you know, he was working in a factory at the time in China, and it was like sepia toned, and it's like the quality of it was so interesting. I was like, how did this photo get taken? Like it looked like you know, just like tintype or something. Like it was so old, and I saw myself in him, and it was wild because you know, like so much of my relationship with him is sort of lost because we moved from China when I was 5, and I never saw him again. And then to see that photo again, and digging through just old photos that my mom kept was something I'll never forget.
Thank you for sharing that. It's really beautiful. Lori, I'm curious, and maybe if it's not, you know, the way we physically think about archives, if there even is oral story or a piece of history that really moved you, if you wouldn't mind sharing it, I would love to hear it briefly.
Yeah, thank you. 2 of them, you know, one, I think about the old ledger art stories and how we historically would gather in the wintertime and record what we would consider, I guess, our historians in contemporary time would draw pictographs on buffalo hides to depict significant tribal history, tribal events, or cross-tribal events, or even some of the most recognized, probably because you know, of the treaty rights and such, is in my case, the Little Bighorn battle, and you know, some of the stories that are told around that. And then another one I think about is, I came across this picture through my my uncle, and you know, sometimes you find out like the deep history of like where that intergenerational trauma might stem from, and you get emotional, you know. And but you know, we all probably know now about the Carlisle Indian School and you know, the other boarding schools across the country. But one of my grandfather's mother went at a very young age, Lizzie, to Carlisle Indian School, and she then came to Genoa boarding school and married there and was working in that boarding school, and had 4 children, and one of them's name was Mark, and his brother George. They went to the Rapid City Indian boarding school, which would then come on to be the like a tuberculosis TB hospital, and then now it's contemporary today is our Indian Health Service, ironically. But that picture, when I saw it, I had no idea of the history, you know, no idea that, well, even of the boarding school, I didn't even remember as a child that there was a Rapid City Indian boarding school. And it was of Mark, and my uncle tells us the story later, and now there's, you know, some children that they found grave sites there, and Heather Don Thompson and some others at Rapid City are doing a lot of work on that right now. And so I found out our history through that picture of young Mark, and he had run away from school and didn't make it home, sadly. So sorry. And but today, you know, I think those pictures become really important because I asked my Uncle Ben about that story, and when he heard it, and he didn't hear it until he was adult, because sometimes those histories were so painful, you know, that the parents didn't talk about it, and then their experience with boarding school and, you know, their history. They didn't really share those stories. So now we're bringing it to life, and the truth of that story of our family, that just tried to go home to the res. They were walking like 80 miles home and fell asleep on a train track and never made it home. So that story, and that was in about 1910, I believe. He passed away when he was killed on the train track trying to get home. So thank you.
Wow, thank you for sharing that. Again, truly the power of an archive and the ability to learn your own history through just one photo, or maybe even be prompted to learn more of your history through one photo, I think proves the point. Stanley, I'd love to hear if you have an image, a moment that you would be willing to share.
Yeah, I think that when we did a Place of Our Own, and I think we'll see a clip that includes some of these photos, we were trying to find, anything of my high school and growing up. And my high school folded and doesn't exist anymore. But we found a teacher, an old teacher, and she led us to another school that had the archives of my high school in their basement. And we found a yearbook, my senior yearbook, where they had, 15, 20 pictures that I was in, but also pictures of my class. And we were able to build a sequence about, my high school from these pictures. It really allowed us to tell a story that we thought that we couldn't tell. So just a bit of digging. And, was it an archive? I don't know. It was a box in the basement of a school that just happened to have the records of my school.
And if I can just say that some of my favorite moments of that film is seeing little Stanley in high school with his big fro and his nice little outfit. I loved it. I really did. Lisa, share a moment.
Yeah, I can think of so many examples, mostly because I teach this class on Black historical fiction, and we spend a lot of time at the Beinecke, which has these extraordinary resources. This is the library at Yale, and just has all of these kind of photographs of Black people from the 19th century, which I just honestly, I never really saw that much of when I was growing up or in school. And so just being able to see images, like there's one in particular that I think about that is undated, but it says, it has written on it, contraband yard, right? And so contraband, of course, during the Civil War would have meant Black people, right, who were enslaved, who had walked up the plantation, who were going to Union Army lines. And so seeing photographs like that, just really changed how I saw that period of history and how I saw Black people, sort of visualized who weren't Frederick Douglass, right? And this kind of sense of immediacy and sense of actually how recent, right, the Civil War was. And I think it's also just a reminder that sometimes we have this idea that there are no photographs like this, that there are no archives, there is no record of this time. And in fact, sometimes there's an abundance of these archives, and so yeah, I think that's been a really special thing to be able to look at in the archives.
Yes, and in film, so often you hear filmmakers talk about, especially if they're telling a historical narrative, about how they did all this work, and to Stanley's point, it's like they sort of got to a point of how much they could tell the story, and then all of a sudden, somehow, an envelope full of photos or whatever, and it completely changes the story. Completely changes what you know of these characters, completely changes their historical, how big maybe of a historical figure they are. So again, just really, really interesting. I'm curious, as we've now talked about sort of the emotionality that archives and particularly personal archives can bring, I'm wondering if the surfacing of archives can ever be harmful to a community, in your opinion. Should one's personal archives ever be off limits, even posthumously? And I want to start with you, Stanley, just because you have done films of folks who have are no longer around. And so I'm just curious, yeah, can a personal archive ever be off limits to you?
That's a really, really interesting question. I can't really think of a case or a situation where they would be off limits that I've run into. Certain people's stories, certain people's life stories can be off limits, but I'm not sure if there are archives that are off limits. When we did the film about Jonestown, we found footage of them building Jonestown and of people who had died, and it just enhanced the story. But so I'm trying to rack my brain and think of something that would say, oh, this is off limits. Maybe some things can be too graphic at times, but off limits, I'm not sure. I'd be interested to know what the other panelists think.
Yeah. Bing, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I agree with Stanley. I think the real question is about permission. I think the question within the question is about permission. It's about consent. And I think, archival could be part of that question. When we were making Minding the Gap, I showed Nina, who's one of the subjects in the documentary, a recording of her getting into a screaming match with her partner, and there was threats of violence in the audio recording, and it was a recording that was being shown to me by her partner, and one of the things that she told us was like, I don't want this in the film. It's embarrassing. It's too much. People are going to think this about me. And like, that was her saying, like, I don't want this archive to be in. But of course, like, me, my producer, and another producer who was there as a support, like, we explained why this was important to us. And because we had built that trust over the course of years of making this film, she understood, and then we both sort of split ways and thought about it. And eventually we came to a compromise. I said I would shorten the recording, so that way, like, we still get across what is important for the story and the larger meaning, as well as honoring, a sense of agency that we wanted to give to Nina.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think as filmmakers, we so often, especially if our intentions are good, right? And maybe that's sort of where this comes in. Before I move to you, Laurie, is sort of, you come upon an archive and you have the power to tell that story, or at least help tell the best and most truthful version of that story. Is that okay? Or should you leave the story to not be told? I mean, it's really hard to tell a filmmaker to not tell a story that is really moving them. So, Laurie, curious.
This is the part where I say, should I just be straight up? So there was
yes, ma'am.
There's been quite a film shot on the Pine Ridge Reservation, and by outsiders that come in and, have a set script. I'm not a filmmaker, everybody watching, but I come from a family of folks in film, including my daughter and her father, Chris Eyre. But yeah, so we've had a lot of conversations around that, where someone comes in with a script and then you read the script and then they come into the tribal community and suddenly the script is no longer the script, and it starts to become, I'm very curious about this family story or that family story. So I'm going to adjust my script to talk about these really hard issues, and then when folks from the community are a part of it, the storyline that gets told that is supposed to be drama, I guess it's called, versus documentary or docudrama, is what part of it's folks is real life and they're playing themselves versus folks that are, should these stories be put on big camera like that? And then, eventually, there's so many people that ventured out to our community. I think in today's times, to see all the good things happening with Native filmmakers and really the contributions of Sundance Institute and the folks that had worked there for so long, Bird Running Water and Heather Ray and others, to contribute to the larger field now of what you're seeing today. But other than that, it's been non-Native folks coming in to tell our stories. So I think that's one that,
There's something to be said about, and I know Stanley believes deeply in this, is telling our own stories, and how you are so often more likely to get a story that is more truthful, more nuanced, deeper, when the person behind the camera reflects the community that's in front of the camera. Eliza, I'm curious about your thoughts on whether some archives should ever be off limits.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I feel similarly to, or I'm going to say something that's sort of similar to Lori. I mean, from the perspective of academia, I mean, the answer is definitely yes, right? I think we've seen how people's sacred objects and even their literal bodies have been abused and put on display posthumously in the name of history, anthropology, science, right? And I think those disciplines are never neutral, and nor are the archives or the facts or the data that they rely upon. And I mean, those might be extreme examples, but I think even when you look at like the collection of African-American photographs at the Beinecke, right? Part of the reason they have such an abundant archive is because of a white collector who went around collecting photos of Black people from yard sales and stuff. And are we grateful to have those images? And are they incredible and precious and extremely valuable? Yes. Are they well preserved and cared for in a way that they otherwise might not have been because they're now at the Beinecke? Absolutely. But I can't help but wonder, to whom those photos once belonged, right? Who has a claim on them? Were they thrown away? Were they lost, left behind, right? What would the subjects have wanted? And to what extent do subjects and their descendants, right, own the rights to their own image? And it sort of reminds me of the case of, at Harvard with Renty Taylor's image. So, and in that same vein, I think scholars can and have used archival material in ways that are harmful to communities. So, yeah, I think it's possible.
Wow. It seems like this is something that, we'll move on, but I want to come back to it in some way, particularly at Firelight, because I think that, there's a nerve there, and a great debate that can be had around archives and the folks that left them and what their intentions were and what our intentions are, maybe as storytellers, to be able to tell these stories. So let's move into Act 2 here. And I want to start with Bing. But before I move into a few questions for you, I really do want to show the trailer for Minding the Gap, which is just such a wonderful film. So let's play that. And again, Bing was nominated for an Academy Award in 2018. The film came out in 2018. He was nominated for an Academy Award shortly afterwards. So let's play the trailer for Minding the Gap.
Take one.
I'm making this film because I saw myself in your story.
I always felt like I didn't fit in with my family.
My parents ran this very controlling house. I ran away a lot.
Skateboarding is more of a family than my family.
How did you get disciplined?
I mean, well, they call it child abuse now, but
Life might be moving too fast. We have to fully grow up, and it's gonna suck.
When you're a kid, you just do, you just act. And then somewhere along the line, everyone loses that.
I knew you had some huge weight on you. Skateboarding meant more to you. It was kind of a life or death thing.
I remember hearing screaming coming from your room, and it was like really, really unnerving.
one of the last things I said to my dad was that I hate you.
You can't just have a child and abandon them. Life doesn't work like that.
I just don't want him to grow up like me. I just want to hide. I just want to run away. That's what the drinking is about.
Maybe you're right. Maybe I need to just move on.
I wish you could. I wish that I can do over.
I could seriously be on the verge of having a mental breakdown, but as long as I'm able to go skate, I'm completely fine.
Coming back to the panel in 5, 4, 3, 2.
Definitely a personal, powerful, and archive-full film. So, and you began filming from a young age. We see it in the film, on skateboards with your friends. Curious, what possessed you to turn on the camera and document your surroundings from, I don't know, age 10, maybe earlier?
Yeah, I broke my arm when I was 14 skateboarding, and I grew up in a very abusive household, so I still wanted to get out of the house as much as possible. And one way of doing that while I couldn't skate was by filming. And but then I sort of glommed on to this whole genre of skate videos that were, there's a whole sort of tradition of skate video making that I didn't know about. And once I glommed on to that as an art form, I just grew obsessed with making skate videos. And so much so to where I started filming more than I skated. But yeah, no, it was just in service of trying to do the thing that I saw other skate video makers do, and it was a very DIY sort of community, and it was normal to spend 3 years making a video, making your own DVDs, pulling together money to on Premiere, and that's just what I did, throughout my teenage years.
And did were you aware? Did you as much as maybe a kid could be aware of the fact that they were actually creating an archive, did you look back at these videos? Did you sort of think about them, think about sort of the modern day sort of history that you were creating in the moment at all? Or when did you realize that you had actually created an archive?
It's interesting. There was this project that I did before Minding the Gap. It was titled Look at Me. And it was sort of in the late 2000s, early 2010s. This is around the time of, the digital revolution had taken hold. DSLRs could shoot video now. And I started noticing that as I was skating, sometimes there'd be more camera lenses than skaters at the spot. It's like, oh, we have triple angles for this DIY skate video. What's going on? What is this doing to skating? What is this doing to us as people who go capture it, when there's just such an obsession with, maybe an over obsession with, archiving this stuff? So I set out to make a documentary about it. I interviewed all the videographers and photographers of skating that I knew, and try to explore that. And I think people were having sort of an existential crisis, and I think they were starting to feel, I think, what a lot of people feel today, which is kind of image fatigue, and I think that has to do with, this is going down a rabbit hole, but skateboarding was getting a lot more corporatized and mainstream at that point, and a lot more embedded with capitalism. And I think images are more embedded with capitalism now, right? It's hard to escape images through the lens of capitalism. And I think you know, like the start of that was what I was feeling. But you know, I don't know if that answers your question, but that's sort of when I started really thinking about, you know, what it meant for me to have grown up just shooting so much video.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't a skater boy, if you will, growing up, but I am curious. Like, it makes me think now that every, you know, let's say every third person or so, maybe that's too much, but had a camera in their hands recording these skate videos. Like, if we could have access to all of those archives, like, might we be able to stitch together, you know, what a subculture looks like, or what manhood looks like for, you know, male skateboarders, etc. It's just that I didn't realize that there was so much footage out there of this sort of community, and what we might be able to, the story we might be able to tell about that time with all of those videos. Just very interesting. I want to show a clip from your film, not just the trailer. And coming out of it, I have a question for you. Just about making deeper connections, so that the archival photos aren't just photos, but they sort of tell a deeper, more nuanced story of your life with this community of young men. So if you can play the trailer from Minding the Gap, that would be great.
Take one. I'm making this film because I saw myself in your story.
Are you gonna put me smoking weed in the thing?
Maybe. I don't think just to do it.
I've given you free range. I mean, I have no stipulations. I've always needed more out of life, more out of where I was. You know, my parents ran this very controlling house, and so I ran away a lot. By like 16, I was no longer living with my parents, like, at all. I just wanted to fucking skate.
You ready for some fucking intense action? Take one. I'm gonna set myself everything. I want to make a montage.
Say hello to the video live.
Hey, do it again.
I can see that thing in there moving around, Bing. I know you're playing with my face or something.
Stop filming, he's going to crash. Hope I get there right on time.
Somebody come! Somebody come! Oh shit, there's a cop.
I love watching that clip. It makes me so just like, you know, I just want to be a teenager again. On its face, Minding the Gap is about young people coming of age. But, you know, as I know, and as so many who have seen it know, it delves deeper into histories of trauma. And, you know, did sifting through your archives help you make that deeper connection? Or once you had the realization of the trauma, did you look at the archives differently? You know, I'm really curious about how the archives were able to allow you to reflect on the trauma that you got to in the film, or how they were able to sort of help you tell that more nuanced story.
Well, I'll tell you one thing first. Like, you know, Minding the Gap took about 5 years to make, but it wasn't until the last 3-4 months when I started looking at the archives. So, you know, this whole section was not in the film until the final months of editing. And I think a lot of it has to do with, you know, when you have a traumatic experience, you know, one way of dealing with it is just by avoiding it, by not, you know, being able to confront it. And so maybe subconsciously I didn't want to go and look at this stuff. But at the time, long time, I think a big reason was that I just wasn't it was also a very late decision to make myself a character in them. And so there wasn't really a need to look at archives, because I didn't even think that I had archives of Zach and Kier until I went back to look for footage of myself. And then I was like, oh, wow, I have footage of them too. Like, maybe this can, you know, now I can do something very different with this film. but yeah, I mean, in looking
Yeah.
through all the, it was a trip down memory lane, and it, I think the only way I could process it was because I was going to therapy at the time. Because I think, oftentimes I think people mistake filmmaking about personal issues as therapy, but I think it's very much not that. I think therapy is therapy. And I think filmmaking, it can be a powerful, way to wade through the past, but it's not necessarily the thing in of itself that can help you make sense of it.
I want to bring in Stanley here because I want to bring in a place of our own now that we're in this sort of filmmaking segment around personal films. Before I do that, though, I would like to throw to Stanley's trailer for A Place of Our Own, which debuted on Independent Lens in 2004. If we can play that trailer.
The island of Martha's Vineyard is a mile off the coast of Cape Cod. And on one edge of the vineyard is the town of Oak Bluffs. For generations, upper middle class black families like mine, have vacationed here. It's been a place where, at least for the summer, the world did not look at us and define us solely by race.
For many, many people, they had to operate in the white world 80% of their life. And, at some point you need a chance to put your guard down.
When I was young, the 8-hour drive to the vineyard was one of the only times my whole family was together. The 4 of us kids fought the whole ride. But when we turned the last bend and saw the ferry, we all got excited because we knew we were almost there.
You knew you were going to come to the vineyard and something different happened. You were free. And we didn't come to Martha's Vineyard, really. We came to Oak Bluffs.
Over the last 20 years, I've watched tourism and development transform Martha's Vineyard and Oak Bluffs into a very different place.
Everybody with information and direction. Welcome to the vineyard, guys.
Where there was a time when you almost didn't know everybody. Children who came here grew up together. I'm not sure I find it as much of a community as it used to be.
It's not just the close-knit community that's changing. Over the winter, my mother died, and the family seems to have fallen apart. Now I wonder what's left for me in Oak Bluffs, where we were all happiest.
Stanley, I watched that film only recently, and I was just kind of like, oh my God, this is just so personal and so beautiful. And we'll dive into it a little bit deeper in a second. But while I have both you and Bing, I'm curious about mining your own personal archives versus mining those of other people. Can you as a filmmaker be objective in both scenarios, do you think? And what was your, if you can maybe let me in a little bit on your process for both of these personal films, were they too close ever when looking through the archives of them and telling the story? So yeah, what is the different feeling you have as a director, and we'll start with you, Stanley, of doing, A Place of Our Own, for example, versus maybe, and looking at the archival there versus Attica, for example?
Yeah, I think one of the things that was really interesting in A Place of Our Own is that my family really did not have a large archive, so that the trailer that you just saw was really the opening of the film, and the shot of, my family driving to the vineyard was just a stock shot. That's not my family's car. It's a car driving down a road. And really it was about finding every little bit of archive that I possibly could. So I already mentioned, going back to my high school. When I was about 12 or 13, I was given a Super 8 movie camera, and I shot maybe 5 rolls of Super 8 film. before I grew tired of it and bored. But I actually found that Super 8 film in a bag somewhere, and we mined the few shots that I had that we had shot of my family. So it was really about kind of mining every single thing that we could. I think that the archive wasn't personal in that way, but the story was personal. So there's a scene where it's the anniversary. My mother has passed, and it's her birthday, and we go to throw flowers in the water. It's the first a birthday that we're celebrating or acknowledging after she passed. And we go throw flowers in the water, and then I turn the camera on myself, and I'm all teary eyed. And in the edit room, everybody, the editor, the associate producer, my wife Marcia, who's kind of helping me write the film, all said that it was corny, and to cut the scene, and I'm like, how can it be corny? It's my mother's birthday, and I'm crying, and they were just, it doesn't work. And so it became I had to understand that sometimes I was so close to the material that I could not really process what worked and what didn't work.
Yeah, I will say that for my own experience with my film, that's the hardest part. I'm curious about collaborators then, Bing, and I'll start with you, is, how do you employ collaborators when dealing with your own personal archival? How can they bring objectivity into your work? And then side note, Marcia told me that it took, and tell me if this is true after Bing, that it took the story about your father really sort of kind of came to light via the work of collaborators, particularly your editor, that, really it was maybe a story about your mom, but then became a story about your dad. But let's start with Bing. I'm curious about how you worked with collaborators to think through the archival that you put into Mining the Gap.
Yeah, I mean, similar to Stanley, we actually didn't have that much. I had one shot of Kier. I had like 6 shots of Zach, and then maybe like 10 clips of like selfie clips of myself. And so I had to source from a lot of other filmers who had also filmed them in order to just get more options. But I think I needed collaborators for myself more than I think I needed it for Zach and Kiera's stories. Because I think, like Stanley said, it's like what, like most documentary filmmakers, I think, don't believe in one objectivity. There's 3 objectivities, right? There's yours, the audiences, and then, the person you're making the film on. And, when it's yourself, like you just can't, it's just impossible to get objectivity, It takes so much work just to have a little bit of self-awareness that, like that shows when we try to tell stories about ourselves as quote unquote characters. So, like there's, I mean, even for this is archival, but there's an interview with my mom in the film, and when I didn't have an editor, I kept cutting that scene in a very expository way. I was like, oh, this scene is about me getting information out of my mom that says things about my character. Like I started skating at 13, I started filming at 14, and then when an outside editor came in, he cut a scene that was about what it was really about, which is me confronting my mom about why she let a man abuse me for so many years. And, I wasn't able to see that. But that's what the subtext of the scene was actually about.
And Stanley, is that a true story that Marcia told me about you coming to the sort of notion that this film was deeply about your relationship with your dad via an editor?
Yeah. I mean, we were making the film, and it was a complete disaster, and we had been funded by ITVS, and I actually called ITVS and said, I'm just going to give you the material and give you back the rest of your money. And, because this film is horrible, it's never going to work. And, to their credit, they're like, oh, no, just keep working on it, Stanley. We think there's something there, and just keep working. And we got a new editor, and the film was kind of about my mother because she had just passed away, and my mother's love of Martha's Vineyard. And she said, just, let me look at the material. And she looked at the material. She said, well, I think the film is not about your mother. It's really about your father. And I was like, you're nuts, and, you're really crazy. But I think at this point I was willing to try anything to make the film work, and she said, let me try to look at the material and give me like a few days, and let me just, put together a string out, of the material about your father. And she did, and we went with it, and the film is really kind of about my relationship to my father, and much more than about my mother. But it was part of, as you said and being said, is trusting. You have to trust your collaborators in a different way, just in a different way than I did on any other film. I mean, I try to trust my collaborators all the time, but in this film I couldn't. In this film, the big thing is I couldn't trust myself. I couldn't.
Yeah, I mean, I think with personal films, you just have to put that out there and say, listen, I have blinders, and I'm going to need you to help me, find what's outside of those blinders. Well, let's talk about the backdrop really quickly because the film is about your father, but it is about Martha's Vineyard, and it is about this Black community, upper middle class Black community on Martha's Vineyard who have been there, for generations. And so I was curious if, while making this film, was it about showing sort of the community to themselves, saying, this is our community, look at yourselves on screen? Or was it a film at all that to show sort of the wider country, if you will, who may be not familiar with the Black community on Martha's Vineyard, familiar with a whole different Martha's Vineyard, that this community was vibrant, that it lived here? So in some ways, using the archival to sort of showcase just how powerful, just how strong, just how real and vibrant this Black community was or is on Martha's Vineyard. Do you get the sort of difference? Like, one, was it by and for the community, or was it a statement sort of writ large that this community lives here and thrives here?
I think we started out wanting to make a film about the Black middle class, and we wanted to make a film about the Black middle class by looking at different Black resorts, and why do African Americans still self-segregate? And so we started making this film about Martha's Vineyard because we couldn't raise, the money that we needed to raise to make, to cover other Black resorts. But it was definitely not a film that was made to talk to the African American community in Martha's Vineyard about themselves. So that definitely was not what it was made to do. A lot of people were really mad at me on Martha's Vineyard because they said that you now made a film about yourself, and we thought you were making a film about us, and you got our home movies and all like that, but now you're making a film about yourself. So it was definitely not a film that was made for the people on Martha's Vineyard.
Mm-hmm. Can we just jump into a clip from the film? And then I have just one lingering question for you coming out of that clip. If we can play a clip from A Place of Our Own.
Okay.
Nothing in the way I grew up could compare to my father's experience of segregation. I was the product of the Black upper middle class life my father pushed so hard to reach. But as I got older, I was uncomfortable being one of the few Black kids in a sea of white faces. By the time I was a teenager, I started looking at my classmates differently. And I knew that on some deep, unspoken level, I wasn't really one of them. On the other hand, I couldn't just take the subway up to Harlem and hang out on a street corner. And I was afraid I would be teased for my bougie roots, the way I talked, walked, and danced. But in Oak Bluffs, it was different.
I learned so much of Black culture on the Vineyard. I remember learning how to slow dance, up here, when I was about 13 or so. A group of us didn't go to the beach. It was 90 degrees outside. We were in somebody's living room. We played the same slow record, Sad Girl, over and over again. We were in our bathing suits, sweating, grinding.
That was what you learned about Black culture, how to grind.
Right. That was the most important thing. That was the most important thing I learned about Black culture, was how to grind. The rest was gravy.
I played that clip mostly for Marsha, but I will say, really, before I ask a real question, just of the young love that is so apparent in Marsha. It just touched me beyond. But I'm curious about when, this is a master class. When should archival, for all the filmmakers that are watching, when is archival a crutch? When do you ever see it used as a crutch versus, maybe a main character in the story? And, do you often talk to filmmakers about that difference, when to lean in to the archival that they have versus lean out of the archival they have and try and find the bigger story? Can you give us some sort of, a master class from Stanley Nelson on, how you think about employing archival in storytelling? When is it too much? When is it too little? And maybe some tips and tricks.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's both all the time. It's always a crutch, and it's always a character. I try to look at archival as one of the characters in the film, and the more archival you have, the better. And it can. A good problem to have is that you have too much archival, and so now you've got to figure out how to tell your story and kind of not use all of it. Usually, when you're telling stories about African American communities, or probably any BIPOC community, there's not enough archival, and you're trying to figure out how to get more and use more. But archival is it's another character, and it can be a really beautiful character. So I try, when I'm researching a film, I'm telling people all the time, just get everything, get everything, everything you can. So we did a film, Attica, where all the archival in Attica really came from news sources, and pretty much we had to buy all the archival. But we're saying, get everything. One of the things about A Place of Our Own is, the scene that you saw earlier with people dancing on the beach and things like that. That we found is, that Martha's Vineyard is an upper middle class community, right? So they could afford to have Super 8 cameras. And where do you film Super 8 cameras? You film on your vacation, So we would be talking to people, and I'd say, well, do you have any archival? And they'd say, wait a minute. And they'd go down to their basement. You could hear them, clinking around in their basement, and they come up with a big box full of footage. So we found a lot of footage of the African American community in Martha's Vineyard. It was interesting that all the footage that we found was outside, because at Super 8, at that point in the 50s and 60s, took a lot of light if you were filming inside, and so they didn't shoot anything inside. Everything was outside, pretty much on the beach.
Yeah, and again, truly a delicate dance when deciding, when to use it as a crutch, and when because it is always a character, but when does it need to be the B character versus the A character? It's certainly a challenge that I had with my own film, and I know that a lot of filmmakers sort of talk through that.